When Claire's loyal golden retriever, Rosie, barked furiously at her fiancé just minutes before the wedding, no one could have predicted what would happen next. But as secrets unraveled and truths came to light, that bark turned out to be more than a warning. It was a lifeline. What started as the happiest day of Claire's life quickly spiraled into a shocking betrayal, proving that sometimes the one who truly knows your heart walks on four legs. Claire stood in her bridal suite, the delicate lace of her dress brushing against the polished floor as she stared into the mirror. The room buzzed with the excitement of friends and family preparing for the big day. Outside, the church bells chimed softly, their sound blending with the distant laughter of arriving guests. But inside, Claire's chest tightened. Something didn't feel right. Rosie, her ever-faithful golden retriever, sat by her feet, her ears perked, and her eyes locked on the door as if sensing an unseen danger. For weeks, Rosie had been acting differently, distrustful of Greg, the man Claire was about to marry. Claire had brushed it off as nerves, convincing herself that Rosie just needed time to adjust. But today, Rosie wasn't just tense. She was frantic. Each bark echoed through the quiet hall, growing louder and more urgent. And then came the moment Claire couldn't ignore, the bark that made her heart stop. As she knelt beside Rosie, trying to calm her, the realization hit like a tidal wave. This wasn't just cold paws or bridal jitters. Rosie was warning her. About what? Claire didn't know. Yet, to understand how a perfectly planned wedding could unravel so dramatically, we have to go back to where it all began. When Claire met Greg and why Rosie, her steadfast companion, saw through him long before she did. Part 2, The Perfect Illusion. Claire's first encounter with Greg had felt like a scene from a romance novel. It was a crisp autumn afternoon at a local charity art show. She had been showcasing her gallery's newest collection, lost in the world of light and color, when he approached her. Dressed impeccably with an easy smile and just the right amount of charm, Greg introduced himself as a corporate consultant with a passion for the arts. He spoke eloquently about her work, weaving compliments that felt genuine, and by the end of the evening, Claire found herself smiling in a way she hadn't in years. After decades of heartache, an emotionally taxing divorce, and the lonely rebuilding of her life, Greg seemed like the answer to every prayer Claire had dared to whisper. He was attentive, thoughtful, and made her laugh in ways she hadn't since her 20s. But most importantly, he claimed to love Rosie. Claire watched as he offered the dog treats, scratched behind her ears, and called her the best girl. It melted her heart. Yet even in those early moments, Rosie's reaction to Greg wasn't as warm as Claire's. She would sit stiffly at his feet, her head tilted slightly as if assessing him. The wag of her tail was polite but not enthusiastic. "She'll come around," Greg said with a chuckle, brushing it off. "Dogs just take time to trust new people." Claire nodded, wanting to believe him. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale of loyalty and revelation, I want to connect with you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had a pet whose instincts amazed you, hit that like button, because Rosie's story is going to leave you speechless. As their whirlwind romance unfolded, Greg was quick to offer solutions to the challenges Claire didn't even realize she had. He insisted on helping her streamline her finances, proposing a joint account to simplify their lives. He encouraged her to consider merging their assets, promising it was just part of building a future together. His logic was persuasive. His intentions seemed pure, or so Claire thought. But Rosie's behavior told a different story. Her subtle unease around Greg turned into outright avoidance. She began retreating to the other side of the room when he entered, her ears pinned back, her watchful eyes following his every move. Greg laughed it off, calling her overprotective, but Claire couldn't shake the discomfort bubbling beneath her happiness. One evening, as they planned the wedding, Greg reached for Rosie's leash and she responded with a low, guttural growl, a sound Claire had never heard from her gentle companion. "That's enough, Rosie," Greg snapped, his tone sharper than usual. Claire hesitated, torn between defending her dog and smoothing over the tension. "I think she's just overwhelmed," Claire offered softly, kneeling to stroke Rosie's fur. But as her fingers moved across Rosie's tense frame, Claire felt a flicker of doubt, small but persistent. Greg's presence had brought so much joy into her life, but Rosie's instincts whispered something Claire wasn't ready to hear. As Claire looked into Rosie's deep brown eyes, she wondered, was it possible her beloved dog saw something she couldn't? The days leading up to the wedding blurred in a whirlwind of last-minute preparations and growing tension. Claire tried to stay focused, but no amount of flower arrangements or seating charts could quiet the unease that gnawed at her. Rosie's behavior had become impossible to ignore. The once calm golden retriever now seemed constantly on edge, pacing the house, refusing to leave Claire's side, and growling low whenever Greg came near. One evening, as Claire sorted through the stack of wedding paperwork Greg had left on the dining table, Rosie lay at her feet, her eyes fixed on the folder. Claire glanced down and smiled weakly. "What do you think, girl? Am I being paranoid?" Rosie didn't respond with her usual wag of the tail. Instead, she stood, nudged the folder with her nose, and let out a low whine. Claire sighed, flipping through the documents. The legal jargon made her head spin, but one line stood out, a clause that would grant Greg joint ownership of her gallery and home once they were married. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't just the wording that bothered her. It was the way Greg had casually slipped these papers into her pile, as if they were no big deal. Rosie let out a sharp bark, startling Claire out of her thoughts. Before she could react, the sound of voices drifted in from the hallway. Greg and his sister Victoria were talking in hushed tones, their words sharp and conspiratorial. Claire froze, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. "You need to push her to sign everything before the wedding," Victoria hissed. "She's already halfway in. Don't lose your nerve now." Greg's reply was cold and calculated. "Once we're married, it's all ours. She won't have a choice." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She clutched Rosie's fur for support, her mind racing. Every doubt, every uneasy feeling she'd buried, came rushing back with undeniable clarity. This wasn't love. This was manipulation. Rosie growled softly, her ears pinned back as if she, too, understood the betrayal unfolding just feet away. Claire pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the storm within her. She needed to act, but how? The next day, Claire met her best friend Janet at their favorite cafe. Over steaming cups of coffee, she recounted what she'd overheard. Janet's expression darkened with each word. "Claire, this isn't just a red flag. It's a warning siren. You need to protect yourself." Claire nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I'm going to confront him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. That evening, Greg arrived home, his usual charm dialed up as he kissed Claire's cheek and asked about her day. But Rosie wasn't having it. She barked sharply, positioning herself between them, her eyes locked on Greg like a sentinel. "Enough, Rosie!" Greg snapped, his irritation slipping through. "No," Claire said, her voice firm. "She knows something's wrong, and so do I." Greg's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" Claire took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. "I heard you and Victoria last night. I know what you're planning." For a moment, Greg's face was a mask of disbelief. Then, as if a switch had flipped, his expression darkened. "Claire, you're misunderstanding." "No," she cut him off, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not, and I'm done ignoring the signs." Rosie growled, her body tense as she stood her ground. Greg took a step forward, but Claire held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "This ends now," she said. "The wedding is off, and if you or your family try anything, I won't hesitate to involve the authorities." Greg's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, but for the first time in weeks, Claire felt a weight lift from her chest. She knelt beside Rosie, burying her face in the dog's soft fur. "You saved me," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You always do." As Rosie wagged her tail, Claire realized that while she'd lost a man she thought she loved, she'd gained something far greater: clarity, strength, and the unwavering loyalty of her truest companion. Together they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in years, Claire believed she could. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and golden, but for Claire, the warmth of the sunlight felt like a cruel joke. She sat in the quiet of her dressing room, surrounded by mirrors reflecting the image of a radiant bride, a vision of perfection that belied the storm raging inside her. The delicate lace of her veil framed her face, her makeup flawlessly applied, yet her hands trembled as she adjusted her bracelet. Rosie sat by the door, her golden fur gleaming in the sunlight, her eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that seemed almost human. Over the past few days, Rosie's unease had grown impossible to ignore. She barked when Greg approached, growled when he touched Claire, and even refused to eat when he was near. As Claire smoothed her dress one final time, the memory of the overheard conversation echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She couldn't silence. Greg's voice, calm and calculating, had spoken volumes. Once everything's in place, she won't have a choice. It'll all be ours. The door to the dressing room opened and Janet stepped inside, her expression a mix of concern and urgency. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" she asked softly, her voice laced with the kind of care only a lifelong friend could provide. Claire looked down at Rosie, who let out a low whine, and something inside her hardened. "No," Claire admitted, standing tall despite the tears threatening to spill. "But I'm about to do what's right." Minutes later, Claire stood at the entrance of the chapel, bouquet in hand, her heart pounding. The music swelled, and the doors opened, revealing a sea of smiling faces. Greg waited at the altar, his polished appearance and confident smile masking the man she now knew him to be. Rosie walked beside her, wearing a floral collar that matched Claire's bouquet. The decision to include Rosie in the ceremony had felt whimsical at the time, but now it felt like the truest act of loyalty she could show. Halfway down the aisle, Rosie stopped. The dog's body tensed, her fur bristling, and she let out a growl that silenced the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Rosie barked again, sharp and commanding, her gaze locked on Greg. Greg's expression faltered, his polished mask cracking for a brief moment. "What is going on?" he hissed under his breath as Claire froze in place. "She's not the problem," Claire said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "You are." The murmurs among the guests grew louder as Claire turned to face the man she had almost married. "I trusted you," she continued, her voice now steady. "I believed in you, but Rosie saw through you before I could, and now so do I." Greg's face paled as he stepped closer, his tone low and pleading. "Claire, don't do this. Not here. We can talk about this later." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "This ends now." Dropping her bouquet to the floor, Claire addressed the gathered guests. "I've just learned that this man and his family never wanted me. They wanted what I built, my home, my business, my independence. But what they didn't count on was Rosie, and the truth she helped me see." The room was silent, save for Rosie's low growl. Greg's parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their composure unraveling. "This is ridiculous," Greg spat, his voice sharp with desperation. "No," Claire said firmly. "What's ridiculous is thinking you could manipulate me into giving up everything I've worked for." With that, Claire turned and walked back down the aisle, Rosie proudly at her side. The crowd parted like waves, their whispers a distant hum. Claire's heart raced, but with every step she felt a weight lifting from her chest. As she stepped outside into the brilliant sunlight, the cool air filled her lungs, and for the first time in days she felt like she could breathe. She knelt beside Rosie, wrapping her arms around her loyal companion. "You saved me," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Rosie wagged her tail, leaning into Claire's embrace, her eyes scanning the door behind them as though she were still standing guard. Moments later, Janet emerged, a mix of relief and pride on her face. "You did it," she said, pulling Claire into a hug. "No," Claire replied, looking down at Rosie. "We did." And as the three of them walked away from the chaos behind them, Claire knew that this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a life lived on her own terms, with her truest companion by her side. In the days following the canceled wedding, Claire found herself standing in the quiet of her living room, staring at the life she had built with a mix of pride and disbelief. The chaos Greg had left behind still lingered in small ways. The folded invitations on her kitchen counter, the bouquet wilting in the corner. But the house itself felt lighter, as if expelling the weight of his deceit. Rosie sat by her side, her golden fur gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. She looked up at Claire, her eyes calm and steady, a silent reminder that some bonds can never be broken. Claire poured herself a cup of tea and sank into her favorite chair, Rosie curling up at her feet. For the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't oppressive, it was peaceful. Yet beneath the calm was an undercurrent of anger. Not at Greg, but at herself. How had she missed the signs? How had she let her desire for love blind her to the truth? Janet's voice echoed in her mind. You didn't let it happen, Claire. You stopped it. It was true, but the sting of almost losing everything still lingered. The next morning, Claire decided she wouldn't let the experience define her. She began clearing out remnants of the wedding, packing up unused decorations, donating her unworn dress to a local charity, and shredding the legal documents Greg had so desperately wanted her to sign. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Her gallery became her refuge. Pouring her energy into new exhibitions, she found solace in the creative chaos. Local artists, many of them women, flocked to her for advice and mentorship, and Claire realized how much she loved fostering their growth. The community she had built through her art now became her greatest source of strength. But it wasn't just her business that thrived. Inspired by Rosie's unwavering loyalty and the courage she'd found in her darkest moments, Claire started a foundation aimed at helping women in vulnerable situations. Named Rosie's Voice, the foundation provided legal resources, financial literacy programs, and emotional support to women facing manipulation or abuse. On the day of its launch, Claire stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. Rosie sat beside her, wearing a collar adorned with the foundation's logo. We're here today, Claire began, her voice steady, because sometimes the loudest warnings come from the quietest voices, voices we often overlook, whether they belong to others or to ourselves. I almost lost everything by ignoring those voices, but thanks to this one right here, she gestured to Rosie, who wagged her tail. I found the strength to listen. The applause was thunderous, but what stayed with Claire was the sight of women approaching her afterward, their faces filled with gratitude and hope. One woman, clutching her young daughter's hand, whispered, "Thank you. You've given us a reason to believe things can get better." That night, as Claire and Rosie walked home under a blanket of stars, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer held her captive. She glanced down at Rosie, who trotted happily beside her, ever watchful, ever loyal. You know, girl, Claire said, her voice soft but filled with conviction, we make a pretty good team. Rosie looked up, her tail wagging as if to agree. Sometimes, Claire thought, the hardest moments in life are the ones that teach you who you really are. And as long as Rosie was by her side, she knew she would never forget that lesson. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where your instincts or your furry companion saved you? We'd love to hear your story. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales, and thank you for being part of this journey with us.